All right, so we will go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everybody to our summer webinar on virtual research, here to stay. We're super happy that you guys could make it. We will go ahead and start off, and I will introduce the panelists for today's webinar. I am Cora Crawford. I am the IRB coordinator here at Solutions IRB. We have Dr. Ayn O'Reilly. She is our chair, and she will be presenting our webinar today. We have Dr. Ron Wallace. He is our reviewer and prison rep. We have Mackenzie Long. She is our educational coordinator. We have Bridget Morales, and she is our billing coordinator, and Josephine Rudy. She is our IRB administrative assistant. A few things before we get started. I just want to let everybody know that we have chats that we'll be sending out during the webinar with helpful information, links to different things that we're talking about, just so if you guys want to go back and look at later, it's there for you. Also, we encourage you to use the Q&A button to send any questions in. We will be doing a question portion at the end. And yeah, we're super excited. I guess if almost everybody had a chance to do this poll. So it looks like about 56% of our attendees today have conducted some sort of virtual research, which is awesome. So there'll be a lot of information for you guys, and also for those who have never conducted virtual research. So let's go ahead and get started. Dr. O'Reilly, off to you.
Thanks, Cora. So, virtual research is nothing new. It's been around for at least several decades. I remember way back when I was in graduate school, we were already using the internet as a means of collecting data and recruiting. For the purposes of our presentation today, we're going to limit our discussion to virtual research as being research that's conducted via the internet. Now, as all of you know, with COVID-19 and social distancing and lockdowns, for a while, we really couldn't do any research. Everything just came to a grinding halt. And after everybody started to get their footing a little bit and determine what was going on in the world, then we saw an increase in our amendments and applications that were focusing on virtual methods of data collection as opposed to face-to-face. And now that we're hopefully moving toward the end of the pandemic, I think it's highly likely that this increase in virtual research, that we'll continue to see a lot of virtual research, and it's going to become something that everybody should have in their toolbox, not only to adjust to things like lockdown, but also because it can make research a lot easier. And, with any new thing that comes along, or any newly used thing that comes along, it represents both opportunity and risk. So the opportunities for researchers can be very, very many. I'm thinking of, the ability to reach a much wider audience, geographically speaking. You could be sitting in your office in Arizona and collecting data from people that are in Spain. It generally can increase the speed of your data collection while at the same time lessening the cost of data collection. So there's no longer a need to travel from place to place to collect data, and you're not collecting data on papers and then inputting it for analysis. So then your analysis can become easier, at least for quantitative studies, as quantitative data collection tools can then very easily link into quantitative data analysis programs. However, there are some risks, And for us as an IRB, we're mainly concerned with threats to confidentiality and privacy. But there are also other risks to consider. For example, sometimes it can be difficult to determine who is actually partaking in your study. So is that person the person they say they are, or are they just doing the survey? So these issues of privacy and confidentiality, which are so key for our concerns as an IRB, while they can happen when you're collecting survey data or instrument data, it's generally a much greater concern in interviews and focus groups, and it is dependent upon what's being asked of the participants. If you're asking people, how much they like the color red and how they respond to it, probably not high risk. But if you're asking them about illegal behaviors or issues of substance use, violence in the home, and sexual behavior, that can become very risky because you never know who might be within earshot of the responses that your subject is giving. And this, of course, increases with focus groups because rather than having one subject in there with you, you may have 5 or you may have 10. And you can't guarantee that the other subjects are going to keep what they hear confidential. So, look for problems like, if don't use participants' full names when they come into the room. So, even for our names, you'll see some of us have a full name up there, some of us do not have a full name up there. It's recommended that first names maybe, or perhaps just participant numbers to try to increase confidentiality. Also, you want to ask the subject that they're in a comfortable but private setting. Of course, when you're remote, you don't really have control over how private the setting is, but offer that, well, we can do this at another time when you're in a private area. Conducting focus group while someone's in, say, Starbucks might not be a great idea. And there are issues with cameras. I have a camera on right now, but you can have your participants use a virtual background to increase privacy if their computer allows for the running of a virtual background. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. And also, we want to make sure that if you're going to record, whether it be audio, video, or both, that needs to be mentioned in the consent, and the subjects need to specifically agree to that. So the common approaches to virtual data collection, surveys, instruments, interviews, focus groups. There are a number of emerging approaches. We've seen research looking at apps that monitor keystrokes, wearable devices like this one to collect physiological data from individuals. So this is a growing area right now. And I'm assuming that we'll start to see more and more unique approaches taken to virtual data collection. With focus groups and interviews, as I've mentioned, the focus group has a much higher level of risk than other forms of data collection. In fact, it has the greatest level of risk. Whether you're doing a focus group virtually or in person, it requires a skilled facilitator so that they can be running the group while you're taking notes on what's happening in the group. And of course, doing that virtually will allow you to go back and review the video so that you can spend your time more engaged with the subjects rather than just jotting notes down. And keep in mind, focus groups don't result in individual data. So if there are 5 individuals in your focus group, that's not 5 data points, it's 1 data point of group data. In virtual interviews, I've already mentioned that we need to ask about a safe and secure location, but we can't really ensure that they're in a safe location. And when you're dealing with research that may be sensitive over video, it can be more difficult to recognize signs of distress, even if you have the video going. If I'm distressed right now, you may or may not see it. Of course, if I burst into tears, you're likely to see that. But if I'm just very anxious, I can sit here wringing my hands and you won't notice it because, of course, my camera is pitched too high for you to be able to see that. So we need to be especially cogent that our subjects might be in distress and maybe check in on them a little more frequently when we're collecting virtual data. Now, of course, the benefits with the virtual data are that you can get my facial expressions real time and you can go back. So, oh, when she's talking about virtual interviews and focus groups, suddenly she becomes really animated. So she must really like that a lot. You can note that and not have to rely on seeing it in the moment as you're more engaged with the listening process. And it does create a very accurate record for your transcription. With surveys and instruments, again, a lot of these do's and don'ts would apply whether they're virtual or not. You're asking questions that appropriately pertain to the study. You're including enough details so that your subjects, participants, are aware of their roles. And this includes, instructions and so forth. So if you're collecting data with surveys or instruments virtually, you're not going to be right there if somebody has a question. So you need to keep that in mind while you're constructing your surveys or while you're putting your instruments together, what order that you're using them, and the instructions that you give to your subjects. And what you don't want to do is ask sensitive questions that don't make sense in the context of the study. You don't want things just thrown in there just to ask the question. No questions about personal data that don't have a purpose for the study. In fact, very often when you get, say, consent information from the individual, any personal information that's there, that it might be a good idea to completely separate that. You certainly don't want to run the risk that personal information is going to attach to surveys and instruments and stay with that data down the road. Data analysis can be greatly aided by virtual data collection. As I mentioned before, with quantitative data analysis, very often you can get surveys and instrument responses that can be directly loaded into quantitative software packages. So your analysis could be finished within a matter of hours. If you're collecting qualitative data, recording will make it easier, and there are a wide variety of software packages available for qualitative data analysis. Some of these can be quite pricey, but there are also open source versions available online that I encourage you to check out. When you're doing virtual data collection, the platform is, of course, a key consideration. A good platform, goes a long way to good data collection. So you want data encryption that guarantees confidentiality. You want reporting notifications for the participants, just like you had with this webinar. You want a secure socket layer. You want to look into whether you need a transcription service or not. I think it would be another discussion to talk about whether you should transcribe your own qualitative data or have someone else do it. I would go with transcribing it yourself, but there are transcription services. And, if you're administering surveys and instruments, there are a variety of platforms out there, Qualtrics, Typeform, SurveyMonkey, there are a bunch of others. look into both the cost and what your specific needs are. And also there are open source platforms available. If you're doing interviews and focus groups, there's of course Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, and just a bunch of others. With all data collection, but especially with virtual data collection, data safety is a big concern. So on the previous slide, we mentioned encryption, we mentioned a secure socket layer, but you want to think about whether an anonymous survey is truly anonymous. So in today's technological world, if I take a survey, you can easily record my IP address, which may not identify me individually, but it might identify a household or several apartments in an apartment building. You generally, we're going to want you to use platforms that are going to separate that out so that you as the researcher don't have access to the IP addresses. And also think about your storage. So where are you storing the virtual data? Is this a place that on a computer that has access to the internet and could be hacked into and copied or stolen? Who has access to the data? So those types of protection issues can be a lot more tricky than in the hard copy world, where it's a matter of, you know, locking things in a file cabinet. And, you know, you also need to think about accessibility and bandwidth considerations. So different populations have different types of accessibility. Not everybody, especially more rural areas, have great access to the internet, and not everybody wants to use the internet or be involved with the internet. So if it's a population that's not highly wired, you may be missing out on a lot of your subjects. So keep that in mind, depending on who the subjects are. How are you going to get to them? On the other hand, the virtual data collections also increased the number of people who can participate, say, from a distance. So I might want to be involved in a research study going on in Texas, but I live in Michigan. I don't need to fly to Texas. I don't need to drive to Texas. I can participate online. So on the other hand, it's a sword that cuts both ways. You might actually have access to a much larger population than you would have prior to virtual data collection. And in those instances where an individual may be more isolated in a rural area, and when bandwidth becomes an issue, you can also use voice over telephone with video conferencing. This will use less bandwidth. And, you know, in extreme cases, you can use the telephone. They may have better access to participating that way than participating, say, in a Zoom room like we're in right now. Very often, when you're doing virtual data collection, you'll want to consider asking the IRB for a waiver of consent documentation. And all of the guidelines for this can be found at 45 CFR 46.117 C1. But in most cases, we can grant a waiver of consent documentation. And things you want to think about is, does the actual link that having a signed physical consent, does that pose the greatest risk to the subject? Is my research minimal risk? And in some cases, is signing of a form not the cultural norm for the participant? But in all cases, participants should be given the option to print or download the consent form. With virtual consent in interviews and focus groups, issues can get a little trickier. So you need to have that consent completed prior to having them enter the main Zoom room if it's going to be a group setting. And you still need to provide all of the generally required consent information in a language that your participant can understand. And the participant must have opportunity to ask questions and also enough time to consider their participation. So it would be a mistake to think that just because they get into that first step where you're presenting them with the consent, that they're going to continue into the research. They still haven't signified consent yet. If you're going to be recording your participants' audio, visually, or both, you need to have a separate statement in the consent telling them that, and they need to agree to that separate from just giving the general consent. So also think about what you might do if they don't want to participate, if they don't want to be recorded, can they still participate? So can they, if it's an individual interview and you were going to audio and video record, can you just audio record? Or, can they participate in the interview and you just take notes? In a Zoom room, some other things that you really need to consider is, what if somebody wants to withdraw their consent during the interview or during a focus group? How's that going to be handled? And how would they, what are you going to do with the data that you've collected from them up to that point? And how does that impact the data from other individuals? For any studies that are dealing with the collection of protected health information, the consenting platform that you use must be HIPAA compliant. So when you're doing the consenting process for surveys and instruments, if you're screening, you want certain people included, not others. Those screening questions need to appear first, and then the consent form and consent must be given, and then go into the surveys and instruments. You can do a click to consent. If you've received a waiver of consent documentation from us, you can do the click to consent option. If not, you can still get what would qualify as a signed consent by using a service like DocuSign. That is considered a signed consent. So if you're using DocuSign, a waiver of consent documentation does not need to be requested. If you're compensating your subjects for their time and effort, keep in mind that some platforms have a built-in service to provide compensation for completion of surveys. So you may be using something like SurveyMonkey, and they may be assisting with the recruiting, and they're going to give everybody that participates 50 cents or donate 50 cents to their favorite charity. You can also have a new window populate at the end of an anonymous survey that's separate from their survey responses. So the link between their responses and what they're going to put in this new window is broken. So you will know that they've participated. You just won't be able to link them with their responses, and they can fill in their information of, if you want an email to send a virtual gift card to, or if something needs to be sent to their physical address, that can be input there. And finally, there are some considerations when we are collecting data from vulnerable populations. So the Code of Federal Regulation only recognizes 3 specific sets of vulnerable population that they discuss separately within the CFR. So pregnant women, fetuses, and neonates, prisoners, and children. But there are other potentially vulnerable populations. So individuals who have some form of cognitive impairment, financially, socially, educationally disadvantaged individuals, some older individuals. These are just examples. There are other individuals who might be considered vulnerable. Subpart B, that covers pregnant women, human fetuses, and neonates, lets us know that just because a woman's pregnant doesn't mean she's a member of a vulnerable population. Considerations for pregnant women pertain much more to clinical studies. In survey research, there aren't as many considerations. So she's participating in a social behavioral educational study, and that is not likely to impact her negatively, and she's not generally going to be considered a member of the vulnerable population for that. However, pregnant women can participate in virtual doctor visits. Data could be collected in that way. So that's another consideration. Subpart C covers prisoners. In general, there are very, very, very limited opportunities for prisoners to participate in virtual research, as the access to the internet and internet connectivity is very limited in a prison setting. So generally, we're not going to be seeing virtual research conducted on individuals in correctional settings. And finally, children. So subpart D covers research with children, and it defines what a child is, which actually is left up to the state. So generally it's an individual under 18. One state sets it at individuals under 19, and there are other specific considerations. So for example, if they've graduated high school, if a young woman has given birth to a child, and so forth. Research with children generally requires both parental permission and assent. The IRB will look at whether permission is required from both parents or just one parent. And we're going to want to see, just like in any other type of research with children, that the assent is pitched to the appropriate level for the child. So an assent form that we might see for a 7-year-old is going to be different than an assent form for a 16-year-old. And there are notable exceptions to obtaining parental permission. So for example, studies that may be asking children about risky behavior, about sexual behavior that might put them at risk if their parents needed to be asked about it. And these surveys mostly are conducted anonymously. And there are some other potentially vulnerable populations. So with cognitively impaired individuals, whether that is from a result of an accident, result of a disease process, we really need to ask ourselves, are they able to understand enough to consent? And if not, who is their legally authorized representative to give consent? Beyond that, in virtual research, a cognitively impaired individual may or may not be able to understand what's being asked of them or what they should do. With individuals who are financially and socially and educationally disadvantaged, we really want to consider whether or not connectivity's issues are going to impair our research. So if you're interested in a homeless population, virtual research may be very difficult, as they may or may not have a device. And with older individuals, we don't assume that just because you're over a certain age, whether that 65 or 75, that the individual is vulnerable. But we do need to consider it. Do they have conditions that might make them vulnerable? Do they not use the internet, so we're not going to be able to get at them with our research? And also visual issues. Can they adequately see what we're asking of them? And is there some way for us to maybe design our research in such a way that they can make the print bigger, or the colors can be different, or sharpness can be different? Or, rather than have the survey they're just clicking on answers, can the screens read it to them and then they respond? So I'm gonna kick it over to Mackenzie at this point, and she's gonna tell you all about some of our helpful resources.
All right, thank you, Ryan. So one of our goals here at Solutions IRB is to provide educational materials to our researchers to aid you in your review process with us, but also to help you in your research design and implementation. How we're doing this right now is we are providing weekly educational posts on our LinkedIn page. This kind of rotates between a 2 to 3 minute read time article or an under 5-minute training video. So we go back and forth between those. So you should be able to just sit for under 5 minutes and get a little bit of new information that should help you with your review process. I'm going to add those links into the chat right now to our LinkedIn page as well as to our blog. The blog is where we post the articles, and then I also share them onto the LinkedIn page. If you have any topics you'd like us to cover, whether that be in a training video or an article, feel free to leave those in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will address those as soon as we can. Cora?
Awesome. Yes. So here at Solutions IRB, we do have consultations available when you are ready to submit a study and you have questions about what level of review it may fall under. We're able to, hop on a quick call, answer those really easily. We have 4 administrators who handle phones daily. We will go ahead and send out some study submission instructions in the chat. Those are updated regularly with any new info that we come across with CFRs, accreditation, things like that. We do keep you guys up to date. So if it's been a while since you've submitted a study with us, it's probably best to reach out to see if there are any new criteria that we've added. And then after the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to either give us a call or email our reviews at Solutions IRB email. And now I think we'll go ahead and start doing some Q&A. We have a few. I think this first one, I'm gonna throw at you. How are you seeing clinical studies going virtual?
We've seen this happen in a number of different ways. Once the environment adjusted to, say, virtual office visits, we've had studies submitted that have looked at patient behavior and responses after virtual office visits. So, are they more likely or less likely to do their appropriate diabetes follow-ups if it's been a virtual visit as opposed to an in-person visit? We've also seen, even before this, we would see a lot of studies that are electronic records reviews. So that's been something that's been going on for quite some time. I don't know that we've had an uptick in those since COVID. But, now that doctors and nurses are doing virtual visits, they've incorporated that also into when they're thinking of doing research. So if they wanted to talk to their patients or interview their patients about whatever the topic might be, that's now an avenue that's open to them. I think one thing that COVID has done for us as far as virtual research is concerned is it's kind of forced a lot of people into it, at least for a short amount of time. And I think that's allowed a lot of people to get comfortable with it. We probably would have gotten to this point eventually anyway. I don't think it would have been as soon.
Perfect. This next one I will direct to Mackenzie. So this is my first time conducting a study. Will it be easier to do virtually or in person?
I would go to Ein's points early on in the presentation. We don't have a preference which one you pick. I think it would depend on what your research subject is, or not subject, but research plan is, and what you're going to be doing with your participants. Some of the things like Ein had said that make it easier is reaching a wide variety and large mass of people would be doing it virtually. You can reach them all over the country or in other countries, and you don't need to coordinate a time and a place to meet up with them. The virtual interviews and focus groups can also be easier, if you'd say that, because you can set them up anytime as it's online. So those would be some factors that I can think of off the top of my head for that. So yeah, I would, if you need to go back to slide, I believe it was number 3 when the recording comes out, because she had some good points on that one.
Perfect. Thank you. Ron, I will direct this one to you. For internet studies that have specific ages, for example, adults or those 16 and under, what are some options for verifying the age of potential respondents?
Okay, that is going to be a little trickier, especially in the virtual environment. Obviously, if you're doing in person, you've got the option to do some kind of verification of the driver's license or something of that nature. A lot of times you're going to have to rely on the honesty of the participant. I think the one way you get around that is you make sure your recruitment strategy is focused on targets or methods that will hit the audience you're looking for. So for example, if you're wanting an adult audience, don't go out and try and advertise on sites that all the teens go to and everything of that nature. If you really are concerned about it, you could ask for some kind of verification like a driver's license or something, but then again, now you're getting into you're submitting personal information that we don't really want to transmit that way. So my best bet is on this one, you're going to have to rely on the honesty of the participants for the most part. I mean, you could have a focus group in person and people could walk in and somebody could look like they're an adult and in reality they're 17. So yeah, you're going to, it's kind of a play it by ear type situation.
Perfect. All right. Now, it looks like we answered this in just in the Q&A area, but I'll go ahead and address it here as well. We had what details are helpful for the IRB about new wearable and other similar devices. We typically need, the device specs, if it's approved by the FDA, what exactly you guys are using this new device, approved device for. And if it's not an approved device, we would do, a non-significant risk determination. And we also have, I'm sure Kenzie will release some helpful information, that takes you back to the FDA and some of their requirements that we have to take into consideration. Let's see. Here's one, and I will direct this to you, Bridget. Has anything been changed or updated in the CFR since the start of the pandemic with virtual research in mind?
No, nothing has been changed, but when something is changed, an email will be sent out. So that is always helpful.
Perfect. Let's see. Dr. O'Reilly. So if my protocol is approved with virtual research, but I find it to be far more difficult this way, can I switch to in-person research through an amendment, or would I need to submit a new protocol completely?
Generally, in a case like that, it's going to depend on what the scope of the research was. So it's a qualified answer. If you're having trouble recruiting people virtually, then you can change recruitment tactics via an amendment. If you're going to change all aspects of the research, it might require a new study. Again, it kind of depends on what the study is.
Perfect. And then this, I mean, maybe Dr. Walsh or Dr. O'Reilly, we have an attendee here who they've been using Qualtrics, and they have been getting a lot, like thousands of fake numbers, emails, and names to get the gift card incentives. Is anybody familiar with Qualtrics and able to offer advice on how to avoid this?
I think that's really an issue that needs to be taken up with Qualtrics. What Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey and some of the others offer is they'll offer recruiting assistance, and individuals are supposed to be then qualified to be in your study. If you're using that service, that's really a Qualtrics problem. If the way you're recruiting is you're not recruiting through them, but you're, say posting flyers or you've sent an email out, then what's happening is it's gotten a very wide audience, and people are just doing it to try to get whatever the compensation is. So in that case, you might need to reconsider how you're recruiting, or in fact, you put up a screening form that will allow you to screen. So you're kind of in between an area of, is it still going to be, were you aiming to get it anonymous? Is it still going to be anonymous, which it won't be if you then have to verify that these are real people doing real things. So this is perhaps one of the biggest hazards of virtual data collection, is if your recruitment becomes widely known and you're offering a significant amount of money, you might get just a lot of bogus participants so that they can scam you out of the compensation. So maybe lower the compensation.
Perfect. And then the last one, I will go ahead and take this one. How should bandwidth be handled if a participant cannot understand me on the phone and the call drops and they need to start over? Would this be considered a protocol deviation? No, because there's a difference between a dropped call or losing somebody, with bad internet, and then spamming them, follow-up visits or calls. Having a call dropped rather than somebody hang up is not, and recontacting them is not a protocol deviation. Let's see. Oh, another question. Is a waiver of documentation of consent needed for all online consent? Example, SurveyMonkey. Yes, if you're not using a HIPAA compliant DocuSign and you're having them, click to continue, and that's giving their consent, that would require the waiver of documentation of consent. Let's see. All right. I don't have any other questions coming in the Q&A right now, guys. So if there are no other questions, we'll give just another second. But if not, we just want to say thank you guys for attending our summer webinar. We hope that you guys learned something. We will, like we said a couple of times now, we will release the recording and the links and helpful information that we have. We'll provide that on our LinkedIn as well as our solutionsirb.com website. And as always, if you have any questions, give us a call, email us. We are always happy to help. We want to make your guys' experience going through the IRB process as easy and painless as possible. All right, guys. Well, I hope you have a great rest of your week and enjoy your weekend. Bye.